The hull breach alarm had been screaming for 11 seconds when Cade Morrow realized the patch wasn't going to hold. He had both hands pressed flat against the emergency seal, a disc of reactive polymer the size of a dinner plate, and he could feel it flexing under his palms, the edges curling inward, where the station's Kelthani pressure was trying to equalize with the vacuum on the other side. The seal was rated for punctures up to 4 centimeters. The hole in the outer wall of docking bay 17 was closer to 9. He could feel the air pulling at his sleeves, at the loose fabric of his coveralls, at the tools clipped to his belt. The whistle of escaping atmosphere was high and thin, and getting louder. "Seal's losing adhesion," he said, to no one in particular, because the bay was empty. Everyone else had already evacuated when the first alarm triggered. Cade had not evacuated. Cade had grabbed the emergency kit from the wall mount, crossed 30 meters of depressurizing deck, and slapped the seal over the breach because the atmospheric venting rate meant the adjacent corridor, the one with 47 people still moving through it toward the emergency shelters, would lose survivable pressure in approximately 90 seconds. The seal had bought them time. Maybe 3 minutes, maybe less. He braced one boot against the wall and leaned his full weight into the seal. His fingers were already going numb. The temperature in the bay had dropped 14 degrees in the last 20 seconds, and condensation was forming on every metal surface: the walls, the grated floor, the docking clamps, the exposed conduit runs overhead. His breath was visible. The seal shuddered under his hands, and a fine mist of atmosphere jetted from the lower edge where the bond was failing. Cade Morrow was 31 years old, an atmospheric systems engineer contracted to Kelthani Transit Hub 9, a sprawling orbital station that served as a waypoint for 17 species and roughly 40,000 transient beings at any given standard cycle. He had been on station for 7 months. He repaired environmental regulators, recalibrated pressure differentials between species-specific habitat zones, and maintained the atmospheric recycling infrastructure that kept several million cubic meters of breathable air circulating through corridors and docking bays and commercial arcades, designed to accommodate biologics that breathed everything from standard oxygen-nitrogen mixes to methane-heavy blends that would have killed him in 4 breaths. He was not a soldier. He was not security. He did not carry a weapon. He carried a multi-tool, a diagnostic scanner, a roll of reactive polymer tape, and a thermos of coffee that was currently rolling across the deck toward the breach because the pressure differential had turned the bay into a wind tunnel. His contract paid him a rate that was generous by human standards and negligible by Kelthani standards. Roughly, what a Kelthani transit worker spent on lunch in a standard cycle. He had taken the contract because the work was steady, the engineering was interesting, and the station's atmospheric architecture was the most complex system he had ever had the opportunity to learn from the inside. He had not anticipated learning it under these particular circumstances. The seal buckled, the top edge peeled free with a wet snap, and the whistle became a roar. Cade felt the air pressure drop, felt it in his ears, in his sinuses, behind his eyes, and he did the only thing that made sense in the moment. He pulled the seal free entirely, grabbed the structural adhesive canister from his belt kit, and began applying it directly to the hull fracture in a thick, continuous bead. The adhesive was rated for thermal cycling on external hull plates. It was not rated for breach containment. He used it anyway because the alternative was that the corridor behind him would become a morgue. The adhesive hardened in 7 seconds. He applied a second bead, then a third. The roar dropped to a hiss. The hiss dropped to a whisper. The whisper dropped to silence. Cade stood there for a long moment with his hands shaking and the adhesive canister half empty and the temperature in the bay at -6 degrees. His coveralls were frosted. His fingers were white. He could feel his heartbeat in his teeth. The bay was silent now, the kind of silence that follows a near miss, when the emergency is over but the body hasn't received the signal to stand down. His adrenaline was still running. His pupils were dilated. His breathing was faster than it should have been, and he consciously slowed it, 4 counts in, 4 counts out, the way he had been taught during his first certification course on Orbital Station Ven, where the instructor had explained that panic kills more maintenance engineers than equipment failure, and that the ability to regulate your own biochemistry under stress was not optional. He regulated, 4 counts in, 4 counts out. The shaking in his hands subsided. Then he turned around and walked back to the emergency kit mount, replaced the half-used seal, clipped the adhesive canister back to his belt, and keyed his comm. Maintenance to Central. Docking Bay 17 breach is patched. Adhesive seal, it'll hold for transit, but it needs a proper weld within 6 hours. Corridor 19B should be safe to reopen. The response was a long pause, then a voice, Kelthani accent. The vowels stretched in that particular way their laryngeal structure produced. That said, maintenance personnel were instructed to evacuate Docking Bay 17. Who is this? Morrow Atmospherics. I was in the bay when it blew. Another pause. The bay was depressurizing. Yes. And you remained. The corridor would have vented. A silence that stretched long enough for Cade to start walking toward the bay's interior hatch. Then, acknowledged Morrow, report to medical for cold exposure assessment. He did not report to medical. He had too many work orders backed up on his queue, and the breach had almost certainly thrown the pressure balance off in at least 3 adjacent habitat zones. He pulled up his diagnostic scanner, checked the readouts, and headed for Junction 41, where the Kelthani low-pressure suite was already showing a 0.4 bar deviation from spec. He spent the next 3 hours correcting cascading pressure imbalances across the station's outer ring. The breach in Bay 17 had been small in absolute terms, 9 centimeters, but the atmospheric ripple it sent through the interconnected habitat zones was disproportionate. The Kelthani suite needed rebalancing. The methane corridor on level 3 was reading high because the recyclers had compensated for the oxygen-nitrogen loss by pulling from the wrong feed trunk. 2 Sulari high-pressure chambers showed microfluctuations that, left uncorrected, would trigger their occupants' barometric stress responses within hours. He fixed all of it, methodically, section by section, working from his scanner and the mental model of the station's atmospheric architecture that he had been building since his first week on contract. By the time he finished, his shift had run 3 hours past its nominal end. He ate a ration bar in a maintenance corridor, drank cold coffee from a backup thermos he kept in his locker, and filed the work orders as complete. That was day 1 of the incident. He would not understand what the incident actually was until much later. He slept 4 hours in his bunk, a narrow compartment on level 4 that the station's human contractors shared in rotating shifts. The bunk was designed for Kelthani proportions, which meant it was too long and too narrow, with a mattress specified for a species that weighed roughly 40 kilograms less than a human male of Cade's build. The springs compressed flat under him. He slept anyway. He had learned, years ago on a construction platform orbiting Threshold 6, that the ability to sleep under suboptimal conditions was not a luxury. It was infrastructure. A maintenance engineer who couldn't sleep was a maintenance engineer who would misread a pressure gauge at hour 14 of a shift, and misread gauges killed people. He woke to 3 new work orders on his queue and the faint, constant vibration of the station's atmospheric system pulsing through the bulkhead against his shoulder. The vibration was normal. It was the heartbeat of the station, the sound of 40,000 beings breathing, processed and recirculated and balanced across 17 atmospheric profiles. He had learned to read that vibration the way a doctor reads a pulse. Steady meant healthy. Irregular meant a compressor cycling wrong. Absent meant catastrophe. It was steady. He got up, dressed, clipped his tools to his belt, filled his thermos, and went to work. The second breach happened 14 hours later, in cargo hold 6. Cade was in a crawlspace between decks, a maintenance shaft barely wide enough for his shoulders, lined with conduit bundles and recycling ducts that carried processed atmosphere from the central scrubbers to the station's outer ring. He was replacing a faulty pressure regulator that had been on his work order for 3 weeks when his scanner lit up with a cascade of alerts. Cargo hold 6, outer hull puncture, estimated diameter 12 centimeters, venting rate critical. He was 400 meters away. The nearest emergency response team was on level 3, a 7-minute transit through the station's main corridors, longer if the emergency bulkheads had sealed. Cargo hold 6 was on the station's commercial ring, adjacent to the open-air marketplace, where roughly 600 beings conducted trade during the primary cycle. Cade pulled himself out of the crawlspace, dropped to the deck and ran. He did not think about it in tactical terms. He ran because the atmospheric venting from a 12-centimeter breach in a hull section adjacent to an open marketplace would pull breathable air out of the commercial ring faster than the recycling system could compensate, and the marketplace did not have emergency pressure doors. It had archways. Decorative, open, architecturally beautiful archways that connected it to the corridors on either side, and that would channel the pressure loss through the entire commercial sector like a funnel. He covered the distance in just under 3 minutes, which was too fast for someone in maintenance coveralls carrying 12 kilograms of tools, but his body did not seem interested in conserving energy. He passed through 2 corridor junctions where beings were milling in confusion, a Vrethani trade group looking at each other with flared gill slits, a pair of Sulari freight handlers pressing their tracheal membranes against the backs of their hands in an instinctive pressure-testing gesture. None of them were moving toward the breach. None of them understood what was happening. They felt the atmospheric shift the way a person on Earth feels the barometric drop before a storm, as wrongness, as unease, as a sensation in the body that the mind had not yet translated into language. Cade had that translation. He had been breathing processed air on stations and platforms since he was 23, and his body had learned to read atmospheric changes the way a sailor's body reads the sea. The pressure was dropping. The oxygen partial pressure was shifting. The temperature gradient in the corridor was wrong, too steep, pulling heat toward a point source of cold that shouldn't exist in a climate-controlled ring. The emergency lights were already strobing when he reached the hold. The interior pressure doors had sealed correctly, but the ones facing the marketplace side had failed to activate. He could see why immediately. The door track was warped. Something had struck it from the inside. The door was jammed, 11 centimeters open, and air was streaming through the gap with a sound like tearing fabric. He could already feel it in the corridor outside, a steady wind pulling toward the breach. In the marketplace beyond, vendor stalls would be rattling, loose items drifting. The species with the most sensitive respiratory systems, the Vrethani with their low-pressure gill slits, the Sulari with their high-pressure tracheal membranes, would feel it first as an involuntary tightening or burning they would not understand. He ignored the jammed door. The breach was the priority. He found it on the far wall, a clean puncture, almost circular, the edges slightly melted. Not impact damage. This was a cutting tool. Someone had cut through the hull. The realization landed cold and certain. He filed it and went to work. The reactive seal from his kit barely covered the hole. He applied it, braced it with both hands, and held it while it bonded. Then he hid it with structural adhesive around the edges for insurance. The venting stopped. He turned to the jammed door, found the manual release, cleared the obstruction, a cargo crate that had been shoved into the track with deliberate force, not displaced by decompression, and got the pressure door sealed. The whole operation took 4 minutes and 12 seconds. His scanner logged it. When he was done, he stood in the middle of cargo hold 6 and studied the breach point. Clean cut, deliberate. And the jammed door, also deliberate, positioned to maximize atmospheric bleed into the commercial sector. 2 coordinated actions. Someone was engineering atmospheric casualties. He keyed his comm. Maintenance to Central. Cargo hold 6 breach is sealed. The puncture was deliberate cutting tool, not impact. I've also cleared a jammed pressure door on the marketplace side. Track was obstructed by a displaced cargo crate. Recommend security review of surveillance feeds. The response was clipped. Maintenance Technician Morrow. You are not authorized to assess hull breach causation. Report to station security for debriefing. He went. Not because he wanted to, but because arguing with Kelthani administrative authority over an open comm channel was a reliable way to get your contract terminated, and he had 4 months left on his tour. Station security occupied a section of Level 2 behind biometric doors, staffed by Kelthani officers in the muted lavender uniforms of the governing caste. The Kelthani organized their civilization by color, rank, function, access level, social standing, even the shade of their naturally variable skin pigmentation carrying involuntary caste signals. Security was lavender because it fell under the administrative branch, which answered to the Regional Transit Oversight Board, which answered to the Kelthani Dominion Civic Infrastructure Council. Cade had been on station long enough to understand 2 things about this hierarchy. It was genuinely complex and not merely ceremonial, and humans occupied no recognized position within it. Humans were contracted labor, external biological maintenance assets, in the official classification, managed through the facilities division, which sat at the bottom of the administrative tree, 3 tiers below the janitorial services sub-branch. The officer who debriefed him was named Silvari Keth. Tall, with the slate-purple skin that marked the administrative caste and silver-sheen eyes that reflected light like polished chrome catching fluorescence. Her 6-fingered hands were folded on the desk with precise uniformity. The office was sparse by Kelthani standards: a desk, 2 chairs, a holographic display showing the station's real-time operational status, and a window that looked out onto the internal courtyard of the security section, where a small garden of bioluminescent Kelthani flora pulsed gently in shades of blue and violet. It was, Cade noted, a very calm room, designed to project administrative composure. Designed for conversations where the outcome had already been decided before the conversation began. She looked at Cade the way a building inspector examines a pipe fitting installed in the wrong orientation. You responded to 2 hull breaches in 14 hours, not a question. I was nearby both times. Your contract specifies maintenance of environmental regulators, pressure systems, and atmospheric recycling infrastructure. It does not authorize independent breach response. The corridor behind Bay 17 would have vented in 90 seconds. The response team would have arrived to casualties. Emergency response teams are stationed at 4-minute intervals throughout the station. 90 seconds, Officer Keth. The gap between your response time and the venting rate is where the bodies would have been. Her silver-sheen eyes were steady, unblinking, Kelthani physiology, not hostility. Cade found it useful rather than unsettling. No blink rate variations to distract from baseline reads. You assessed venting rate, calculated corridor compromise time, and made a tactical decision to intervene, all within seconds. That is not standard behavior for an atmospheric systems technician. Cade said nothing. The Kelthani had a specific framework for understanding human contractors, and it did not include tactical decision-making under pressure. Anything outside the framework was an irregularity. Irregularities were investigated. Findings produced contract reviews. She studied him for a long time. Then, the second breach was caused by a focused plasma cutter applied to the interior surface of the hull. I saw the edges, melted not fractured. Hull breach causation is a security matter. You will confine your activities to designated maintenance responsibilities. If you encounter a breach, evacuate and allow emergency response to address it. And if the response team is 7 minutes out, and the venting is going to kill people in 90 seconds. She blinked the first time in the conversation. A single, slow blink that lasted almost a full second. In Kelthani body language, the equivalent of a flinch. That scenario is addressed by automated emergency systems. The automated doors on the marketplace side of cargo hold 6 failed because someone jammed a cargo crate into the track. Your automated systems were deliberately compromised. Another blink, that has been noted. Has it been addressed? Your input is not required on security matters, Morrow. He left. On his way out, he passed through the security section's main corridor. The walls were lined with informational displays, station schematics, personnel rosters, emergency protocol summaries. One display showed the station's species classification database. He paused long enough to read the entry for humans. Species Homo sapiens Terran. Origin, Sol 3 Earth, Class 11 Deathworld Provisional. Gravity tolerance, 1 standard native, 0.61 for operational. Atmospheric requirement, oxygen-nitrogen standard mix. Threat classification, Category 3 moderate individual physical capability, negligible strategic significance. Recommended deployment, manual labor, environmental maintenance, cargo handling. Cultural note, social species, hierarchically responsive, prone to unsanctioned initiative under stress. Administrative recommendation, close supervision recommended for high-value infrastructure assignments. Prone to unsanctioned initiative under stress. He almost smiled, almost. He fixed the Kelthani suite's pressure deviation, recalibrated 2 scrubbers in the residential sector, replaced the faulty regulator from his earlier work order. The regulator was a standard Kelthani manufacture atmospheric control valve, designed for a 15-year operational life. This one had lasted 11 months. The failure mode was a hairline fracture in the valve housing thermal cycling stress, exacerbated by the fact that the housing was designed for the gentle temperature variations of a garden world climate, not the sharp differentials that existed at the boundary between a human standard corridor and a Kelthani low-pressure zone. He had flagged the design limitation in a maintenance report 4 months ago. The report had been filed. Nothing had changed. He ate dinner in the human contractor's mess, 8 tables, fluorescent lighting, a food synthesizer that produced approximate shepherd's pie. He sat alone. 2 other contractors were at the far table, Petrov, who handled plumbing on the station's lower ring, and Chen, who maintained the power distribution grid on level 6. They nodded to him. He nodded back. They did not ask about the breaches. Word traveled fast on a station, but maintenance contractors had learned that drawing attention to yourself in a Kelthani administrative hierarchy was rarely productive. He drank coffee from his thermos and thought about the clean cut, the jammed door, the marketplace archways with no emergency seals, about the fact that someone was exploiting the station's own architecture, designed by a species that had never evolved alongside deliberate predation, to convert single hull punctures into cascading atmospheric events across entire sectors. He pulled up the station's public environmental schematics on his personal terminal and began mapping. Every atmospheric flow path between every hull section and every occupied space, every pressure boundary, real and decorative, every emergency bulkhead and every open archway that should have been a bulkhead but wasn't. He worked for 6 hours. He built a 3-dimensional model of the station's atmospheric architecture, tracing every duct, every trunk line, every decorative transition that an architect had chosen over a sealable door. He cross-referenced the model against species distribution data, which zones housed which biologics, what atmospheric requirements each needed, what the tolerance margins were. The Kelthani low-pressure zones clustered on levels 4 and 5. The Sulari high-pressure enclave on level 6. The methane breathers in their sealed section of level 3. Between them all, the standard oxygen-nitrogen atmosphere that humans and most carbon-based species breathed, held in equilibrium by a network of regulators, recycling systems, and atmospheric boundaries that ranged from hardened engineering to what amounted to hope and decorative molding. When he finished, he had 11 points, 11 locations where a hull breach would cause cascading atmospheric failure in occupied spaces before emergency systems could compensate. 11 places where the station's own architecture would amplify a single puncture into a mass casualty event. He studied the map for a long time. The 11 points formed a pattern that an architect would never see, but an atmospheric engineer couldn't miss. They were all at intersections, places where two or more atmospheric zones converged, where pressure boundaries were maintained by gradient rather than physical seal, where the station's designers had chosen flow over containment. They were the joints in the station's skeleton, the places where a single crack would propagate through the entire structure. He had seen this pattern before, not on a station on Earth. River systems did the same thing. The flood didn't destroy the levee where it was strongest. It found the junction where two levees met, where the engineering handoff created a seam and it pushed through the seam. The attacker was thinking like water, like gravity, like any force that finds the path of least resistance through a system, designed by people who didn't think in terms of deliberate force. Cargo hold 6 was point 4, base 17 aligned with point 2, 2 for 2. The attacker was working from the same map, or one built from the same understanding of how systems fail when someone wants them to. The third breach came 2 days later. Cade had been checking his 11 points on a 4-hour rotation, slotted between regular maintenance work orders like additional stops on a delivery route. He logged each check on his personal scanner: time, atmospheric readings, hull integrity by handheld sonar, visual inspection of adjacent crawlspace access points, 40 hours of additional patrols on top of 12-hour shifts. He had slept 9 hours in 3 days and consumed enough coffee to concern a physician. He did not feel tired. He felt like a man watching gauges in a system approaching failure. Point 7. A maintenance access corridor on level 5, running parallel to the Kelthani diplomatic suite. Narrow, unmonitored by the primary security grid, it was rated for service access only. It shared a wall with the suite's atmospheric processing chamber, which maintained the low-pressure, high-nitrogen environment that Kelthani physiology required. A breach in the corridor would vent standard atmosphere into the suite, flooding the space with oxygen at concentration that would cause acute respiratory toxicity in Kelthani lungs within minutes. Gill-slit swelling, tracheal constriction, loss of consciousness in the youngest and oldest first. The suite was hosting a trade delegation of 19 individuals, including a regional arbiter and her staff. 11 of the 19 were under Kelthani majority-age children, brought because Kelthani diplomatic culture did not separate families during extended negotiations. Cade had already checked points 1 through 6 in the previous rotation. Point 1 was clean. Point 2, the Bay 17 area had been properly welded by the repair crew, and the atmospheric readings were stable. Points 3 through 6 showed no anomalies. Point 7 was next. He entered the corridor at 3:47 station time. The lighting was maintenance grade. Dim amber strips along the floor, enough to see by but not enough to work by. He carried his own work light clipped to his chest, a habit he had developed on Threshold 6, where the maintenance corridors were lit by a single overhead panel per 50 meters, and the shadows between panels could hide anything from a loose conduit coupling to a pressure seal failure that would kill you in the time it took to identify it. The corridor was quiet. Climate control hummed through the walls, the low-pressure nitrogen mix for the Kelthani suite on the other side, maintained by the atmospheric processing chamber that Cade had serviced twice in the past month. He knew this section the way he knew his own hands. The wall temperature, the the vibration frequency, the baseline electromagnetic readings. He had a mental profile of every meter. Which was why, when the subsonic hum started, he recognized it immediately. A low vibration in the deck plating under his boots. Focused plasma burning through composite hull plating from the other side of the wall. He came around a bend and saw the glow. Orange-white, concentrated to a point, tracing a slow arc across the wall surface. Someone on the other side was cutting through. 3 actions in rapid sequence. Reactive seal from the kit. Structural adhesive canister. Fire suppression handle on the corridor wall, triggering the emergency atmospheric purge, flooding the section with inert argon gas. Plasma cutters require atmosphere to maintain their ionized arc. Argon does not support ionization at portable energy levels. The arc collapsed. The hum died. The cutting stopped 6 centimeters through an 8-centimeter wall. 2 centimeters from full penetration. 2 centimeters from flooding the Kelthani suite with oxygen-rich air that would have poisoned 11 children. Cade sealed the partial breach with adhesive, waited for the argon cycle to clear and keyed his comm. Maintenance to Central. Attempted hull breach, Level 5, Corridor 12C, adjacent to the Kelthani diplomatic suite. Cut interrupted by fire suppression argon purge. Partial penetration sealed. The cutter was operating from the exterior crawlspace. Send security to the access points. 8 seconds of silence, then a voice he recognized as Senior, Morrow, again. Yes. Stay where you are. Security came, and this time they brought more than lavender. Councillor Deathworld, Civic Infrastructure Council, the governing body that administered Transit Hub 9, walked at the front, wearing no uniform but carrying himself with the particular stillness of someone who did not need one to communicate rank. His skin was the deepest shade of slate purple Cade had ever seen on a Kelthani, marking either ancient lineage or extreme seniority or both. Behind him, 4 officers in standard lavender and 3 in deep violet, a color Cade had never seen on Kelthani's staff. Deep violet, he would learn within the hour, was the color of the Kelthani Dominion's Internal Threat Division, a branch of the governing authority that most citizens did not know existed. 3 breaches in 3 days, the counselor said, and you have been present at all 3. Cade addressed the implication directly. Bay 17, I was working in the adjacent section. Cargo hold 6, I responded to the atmospheric alert from 400 meters away. Corridor 12C, I've been checking the station's high-risk breach points every 4 hours because I built a vulnerability map after the second breach. A vulnerability map. 11 points where a hull puncture causes cascading atmospheric failure in occupied spaces before your emergency systems can compensate. My job is to understand how air moves through this station. Air doesn't care about administrative hierarchies or security clearance levels. Silence from the officers. The Kelthani deference posture, stillness during a superior's deliberation. Cade waited. You believe the breaches are coordinated, Deathworld said finally. 3 breaches, 3 days, all in locations where the station's architecture amplifies the atmospheric damage beyond the immediate zone. Bay 17, adjacent to a corridor with no emergency pressure seal. Cargo hold 6, next to a marketplace with open archways instead of sealable doors. Corridor 12C, sharing a wall with a non-standard atmosphere diplomatic suite. The sites were selected for cascading effect. Someone studied the station's layout and identified the same failure points I did. Come with me. Cade followed. The counselor moved through the station's corridors with the unhurried pace of someone who owned the space he walked through. Officers stepped aside. Security doors opened before he reached them, biometric sensors reading his approach and clearing him at range. The Kelthani administrative hierarchy was many things, but it was not slow to recognize authority. When a counselor moved, the station moved with him. The Secure Operations Center, was behind the security section, staffed by deep violet officers. The holographic display showed the full security architecture: 412 external sensors, 81 internal monitoring nodes, a threat detection algorithm cross-referencing atmospheric, structural, and personnel data in real time. None of it had flagged the breaches before the venting began. The cutting events produced no detectable signature prior to hull penetration, a deep violet officer explained. The plasma tool operates below our sensor threshold, slow, quiet, thermally shielded. We detect the consequence, not the cause. How did you detect the third? The counselor asked. The officer looked at Cade. We didn't, he did. Cade projected his map onto the display. 11 points, each annotated with atmospheric pathways, downstream occupied spaces, species-specific tolerance thresholds, and time-to-casualty estimates. The room was silent as the data populated the holographic model. Cade's map was rough, built on a personal scanner with civilian-grade processing power, using public schematics and his own crawlspace observations. But it was structurally sound. Each point was connected to its downstream effects by lines that traced the actual atmospheric pathways through the station, not the idealized pathways shown in the design schematics. The difference was significant. The design schematics showed clean, symmetrical airflow patterns. Cade's map showed the real flows, the ones shaped by 7 years of patch repairs, modified ductwork, sealed-off corridors, and the accumulated compromises that any complex system accrues over time. One of the officers overlaid the station's official vulnerability assessment. The comparison was immediate and uncomfortable. The official model had identified 3 high-risk points. Cade's had 11. The official 3 were a subset of his, but the other 8, including the 2 actual breach sites, were absent from the station's own analysis. Your vulnerability model is more comprehensive than ours, the deep violet officer said. No inflection. The absence of dismissal was, in Kelthani professional culture, significant. I work inside the ducts. I know where the air goes. Your assessment modeled external threats, hull impacts, debris, structural fatigue. It didn't model someone cutting from inside, targeting intersections between atmospheric zones. Different threat model, different map. The counselor gave him a restricted comm frequency chip. Report to this frequency. Not central, not station security. And if you're at a breach point when the cutter starts, do what you have been doing, Morrow. He went back to work. Regulators, scrubbers, 4-hour checks. The routine was meditative in the way that repetitive manual labor is meditative for a species that evolved to monitor its environment for threats even while performing mundane tasks. His hands worked the valves and his eyes checked the seals and some deeper part of his brain. The part that had kept his ancestors alive on a world where everything from the weather to the bacteria was trying to kill them. Cataloged every anomaly, every vibration that didn't belong, every shadow that moved wrong in the service corridors. And he refined the map, adding data from the crawlspaces, thermal residue in hull plating, vibration harmonics in deck sections. The faint electromagnetic pulse signature a shielded plasma cutter left in composite layering even when it operated below the station's detection threshold. On day 4, something else surfaced. 3 maintenance access hatches on the station's inner ring, hatches leading to core service corridors, had been accessed within the previous 48 hours according to the automated log. Valid maintenance codes. No corresponding work orders in the facility's division queue. Someone was using legitimate credentials to move through the station's maintenance infrastructure without documented purpose. He logged it and forwarded it to the restricted frequency. The response was immediate. Noted. Continue your observations. He also noticed something the access logs did not show directly, but that his own crawlspace surveys revealed. Tool marks. Fresh scratches on the interior surface of maintenance shaft 7, the main service conduit that ran from the outer ring to the station's core. The scratches were consistent with heavy equipment being dragged through the shaft. They were recent. The exposed metal beneath the scratches had not yet begun to oxidize in the station's climate-controlled atmosphere, which meant they were less than 48 hours old. Maintenance Shaft 7 led to the station's central core, to the recycling array, to the atmospheric nexus. He photographed the marks with his scanner, noted their position, and continued his patrol. He did not report the marks immediately. He was building a picture, and pictures built from partial data were worse than no picture at all. In atmospheric engineering, a misread sensor could cause you to compensate in the wrong direction, creating the very failure you were trying to prevent. The same principle applied here. He would wait until he had enough data points to draw a line, and then he would draw it. The fourth breach attempt came on day 5. Point 9 on his map. A junction where the main atmospheric trunk line crossed over the station's central medical facility. A breach there would collapse the medical ward's sterile positive pressure environment, introducing environmental contaminants into every surgical theater and immunocompromised patient bay. Cade was in the crawlspace above the junction when he detected the electromagnetic signature, faint, rhythmic. The characteristic pulse of a plasma cutter's shielding coil, cycling through warm-up. He followed it through 40 meters of crawlspace, navigating by touch where the passage narrowed to shoulder width. Conduit bundles pressed against his back, recycling duct joints caught on his belt. The air in the crawlspace was warm waste heat from the systems running through these conduits, unregulated in the service passages, because the Kelthani climate management systems didn't extend to spaces that weren't rated for habitation. Cade's coveralls were already damp with sweat. His tool belt caught on a junction box, and he paused to free it without making noise. The electromagnetic pulse was getting stronger, closer. He could feel it in his fillings, a faint, subsonic buzz that most humans would dismiss as a headache, but that Cade recognized from 7 months of working alongside plasma-based cutting and welding systems. Every plasma tool had a signature. This one was running a warm-up cycle, which meant activation was imminent. He found the cutter, mounted on a magnetic tripod, aimed at the hull section directly above the medical ward's primary sterile chamber. Timer circuit showing 12 minutes to activation, automated. No operator present. They had gone remote. He disabled it, power cell disconnected, focusing element removed, the entire assembly secured in his tool bag. Keyed the restricted frequency. Morrow. Point 9. Automated cutter magnetic mount 12-minute timer. Disabled and recovered. No operator remote deployment. Also, 3 unauthorized entering hatch accesses in the last 48 hours. Valid credentials, no work orders. Someone is staging through core corridors. Deathworlder, bring the device. The deep violet officers disassembled it in a clean room while Cade watched through a viewport. Commercial-grade Kelthani plasma cutter, modified with thermal shielding, vibration dampening, and a timer built from station vendor components. The modifications demonstrated intimate knowledge of the station's sensor specifications. Someone knew exactly what the detection threshold was and had engineered the device to operate just beneath it. Built by someone inside, Cade said. Someone with access to your sensor threshold data, your maintenance credential database, and enough technical knowledge to modify commercial equipment to military-grade stealth specifications. That conclusion has been reached. Then think about the trajectory. 4 attempts in 5 days. Manual, then targeted manual, then automated. Escalating sophistication, decreasing physical exposure. The unauthorized access codes mean they're moving through core corridors, the paths that lead to the station's critical infrastructure. They're not probing anymore. They're staging. He paused, let them process. Your assessment found 3 vulnerability points. Mine found 11. But there's one I left off the map because the atmospheric modeling was uncertain. Point 12. The station's primary atmospheric nexus, where the main recycling trunks converge before redistribution. A breach at the nexus wouldn't vent a single section. It would compromise the pressure balance across the entire station simultaneously. Every habitat zone, every commercial sector, every residential block. Species-specific environments collapse first because they depend on maintained differentials. Kelthani, methane breathers, the Sulari high-pressure enclave, atmospheric contamination across 17 species breathing requirements, all at once. The room was motionless. That's not sabotage, that's a weapon. And the 4 previous attempts were calibration, testing response times, measuring detection gaps, confirming they can move through your infrastructure undetected. Where is the nexus? Level 1, Central Core, behind the primary recycling array. Access through Maintenance Shaft 7, the only conduit wide enough for the cutting equipment needed to breach the nexus housing. The housing is triple-layer composite, 22 centimeters thick. A standard cutter would take hours, but a modified cutter with a Velith accelerant charge could do it in under 4 minutes. Velith, thermite analog, Kelthani military compound. It's referenced in the fire suppression training manual. The suppression system has a specific protocol for Velith combustion because conventional extinguishing agents can't address it. Page 47, Section 12, Subsection C, if someone paired a modified cutter with a Velith charge and timed the activation during a diversionary breach at an outer ring point, the nexus event could go undetected until equalization was already underway across the entire station. Every Kelthani in the room was looking at him. How do you know about Velith? I maintain the fire suppression systems. I read the manual my first week on station, all of it. Every page, every protocol, every chemical reference table. On Earth, we have a saying, know your building or your building kills you. It applies to stations too. The deep violet officer closest to the display turned to the counselor. His analysis of the threat escalation pattern is consistent with our own internal modeling. The automated deployment phase, the credential exploitation, the movement through core infrastructure. Our projection models suggest a high-probability nexus-targeted event within the next 72 hours. The counselor's voice was very controlled, and your models did not identify the nexus as a target. Our models identified the nexus as a structural asset with redundant protections, Category Alpha infrastructure. The housing is reinforced to military specification. The access routes require dual authorization codes. The probability of unauthorized breach was assessed as negligible. Negligible, the counselor repeated. The assessment did not account for an attacker with valid maintenance credentials, knowledge of the sensor threshold specifications, and the capability to manufacture a Velith accelerated cutting device from commercially available components. The officer paused. The assessment did not account for someone who thought about the station the way he does. She was looking at Cade. Take us to the nexus. Cade led them down, through the service corridors, past the recycling array, into the core of the station where the atmospheric trunk lines converged like arteries meeting a heart. He moved through the maintenance infrastructure the way he always moved through it, reading the systems as he passed. A pressure differential at junction 12 that he mentally flagged for tomorrow's work order. A faint whistle from a recycling duct joint that meant the gasket was starting to fail. The temperature gradient across the transition zone between the human standard corridor and the core's neutral atmosphere. His body cataloged it all, automatically, the way a surgeon's hands map anatomy without conscious instruction. The Nexus chamber was behind a sealed hatch, his maintenance access code, the counselor's security override. The chamber was large, cylindrical, filled with the deep constant hum of processed air being routed to every section of the station. The trunk lines were massive, 2 meters in diameter, composite-walled, vibrating faintly with the volume of atmosphere they carried. At the center, where the trunks converged, sat the Nexus housing, a reinforced structure the size of a small room, sealed, insulated, marked with warning placards in 6 languages. The Velith charge was already in place. Cade saw it first. His eyes were trained to notice things that did not belong in atmospheric systems: a fitting the wrong color, a seal applied at the wrong angle, a cable run that didn't match the station schematics. The charge was mounted against the Nexus housing near the floor, partially concealed behind a conduit bundle. Compact, roughly the size of a tool case, connected to the housing by 4 magnetic clamps, and a detonation circuit counting down from 47 minutes. "Stop!" The word came out flat, calm, in the same tone he used when he told Central that a pressure reading was outside spec. Everyone stopped moving. Velith charge on the Nexus housing, 47-minute timer, detonation circuit is visible. The Kelthani froze, not a tactical freeze, an instinctive one. Their species had evolved on a low-threat garden world where the primary survival strategy was stillness. They went rigid, eyes wide, silver sheens flaring bright in the chamber's work lighting. 12 officers locked in place simultaneously. Cade walked forward. "Morrow." "I can see the circuit." He knelt beside the charge. Hands steady, breathing measured. Standard Kelthani commercial detonation timer. The circuit runs through a magnetic relay before it reaches the Velith. If I disrupt the relay's magnetic field, the circuit opens and the detonation pathway breaks. "You are not an explosive ordnance technician." "No, I'm an atmospheric systems engineer, and if this charge detonates, 40,000 people on this station stop breathing." He looked over his shoulder at the counselor. "Do you have an ordnance technician who can reach this chamber in 46 minutes? Silence. 45 minutes now. Proceed." The relay was a gray box on the left side of the detonation circuit, fist-sized, connected to the timer by 2 leads and to the detonator by a single high-gauge wire. The relay was designed to close when the countdown reached 0, completing the circuit and sending current to the detonator embedded in the Velith. If the magnetic field inside the relay was disrupted before 0, the relay would open permanently and the circuit would die. He needed a magnet, a strong one, stronger than the relay's internal field. He inventoried his tools. Diagnostic scanner, sealed magnets inside the casing, inaccessible. Multi-tool steel, not magnetized. Adhesive canister, no ferromagnetic components. Comm unit, insufficient magnetic shielding. Nothing on his belt was strong enough. He looked at the charge itself. The 4 magnetic clamps holding it to the Nexus housing were industrial grade. Rare earth magnets rated for several hundred kilograms of holding force. He detached one. The clamp came free with a metallic snap that echoed in the chamber. The charge shifted slightly against the housing, still held by 3. The movement was small, perhaps 2 centimeters, but in the silence of the chamber, with 12 Kelthani holding their breath and a timer counting down, it felt seismic. He held the detached clamp in his right hand. It was heavy, dense with the rare earth magnetic material that gave it its holding force. He could feel the magnetic field radiating from it, a force that was invisible but as real as gravity. He positioned it against the relay housing, aligned the field axis with the relay's internal orientation, a calculation that took him roughly 2 seconds, and that he performed based on the relay's visible wiring configuration, and a working knowledge of electromagnetic field dynamics that he had acquired not from any formal training, but from 10 years of working with magnetic seal atmospheric valves, and pressed. The magnetic field inside the relay collapsed. The circuit broke. The timer kept counting. It was an independent mechanism, but the detonation pathway was severed. The charge sat inert, ticking toward a 0 that no longer connected to anything. Cade stood up. His knees ached from the cold floor. His hands were steady. His heart rate, he checked his biosensor, 112 beats per minute. Elevated, but within the parameters he recognized from years of work in systems where a mistake meant a pressure wave through a populated compartment. Charge is disabled. The relay is permanently open. The timer is disconnected from the velith. Your ordnance team should extract the charge itself. I can disrupt a circuit, but I'm not pulling military-grade thermite off a wall. The deep violet officer who had analyzed the recovered cutter stepped forward. She studied the disabled charge, the detached clamp, the open relay. Then she looked at Cade. He diffused it with a magnet from its own mounting hardware. I used the tools available. Deathworld stepped close. The height difference was pronounced. Cade's eyes were level with the Kelthani's collarbone. The silver-sheen eyes looked down at him with an expression that was too layered to read easily. Morrow, your classification in our system is External Biological Maintenance Asset. You are filed under the Facilities Division, 3 tiers below the Janitorial Services sub-branch. Your security clearance is listed as non-existent. Your authorization to handle explosive ordnance is non-existent. Your species is classified in our threat assessment database as Category 3, moderate individual physical capability, negligible strategic significance. I know what the database says. The database is wrong. The chamber hummed around them, atmosphere flowing through trunk lines, 40,000 lives sustained by systems that Cade maintained, and the Kelthani administered, and someone had tried to weaponize. It's not wrong about everything, Cade said. I am a maintenance technician. I fix regulators and recalibrate scrubbers. That's not a cover story. That's what I do. That's what I'm good at. And yet I also understand pressure and flow and failure points, and what happens when systems break under load. That's not a special skill. That's what living on a planet like mine teaches you. Everything on Earth is trying to kill you, the weather, the geology, the biology, half the chemistry. You learn to read systems because the ones who don't read systems don't survive long enough to pass on the lesson. You learn to act under pressure because the window between a problem starting and a problem killing you is measured in seconds, not minutes. And you learn to use whatever is in your hand, because you almost never have the right tool. You have the tool you have, and you make it work or you die. The counselor was silent. Your species evolved on a garden world. 0.8 gravity, stable climate, low seismic activity, no apex predators above 50 kilograms. You built a civilization of extraordinary sophistication because you never had to spend half your cognitive resources on not dying. You built this station, and it's remarkable. The architecture, the integration of 17 species' atmospheric requirements into a single functioning ecosystem, the elegance of the pressure gradients and the flow dynamics. It's the most complex piece of atmospheric engineering I've ever worked inside, and I've worked systems on 3 different worlds. He paused. But you built it like people who have never been hunted. Open archways instead of sealable doors. Decorative transitions instead of hard pressure boundaries. Atmospheric pathways optimized for aesthetic flow over containment redundancy. Your emergency systems handle component failures, a duct rupture here, a valve malfunction there. They are not designed for coordinated, intelligent exploitation by someone who has studied those systems and built a strategy to overwhelm them in sequence. You assumed the threat model was entropy, natural decay, the gradual breakdown of materials under stress. You did not build for intent. He let that word sit in the air for a moment. Intent. On Earth, it was the dividing line between a natural disaster and a war. The Kelthani, he had come to understand, had no experiential framework for the distinction. Their history contained disputes, political conflicts, even territorial disagreements, but they had never experienced predation. They had never been a species that another species hunted. Their civilization was built on the assumption that threats were systemic, not personal. That danger came from physics, not from a mind that wanted you dead and was willing to study your weaknesses to achieve it. You built a system that assumes accidents and equipment failure, he said. And someone who understands that assumption is using it to kill people on a scale your emergency systems were never designed to handle. You are saying our station is fundamentally flawed. I'm saying it was built by a species that never had to think about what a determined predator would do with access to the ventilation system. My species has. We've spent our entire evolutionary history doing exactly that, studying systems, identifying weak points, exploiting them. It's how we survived a world that produces new ways to kill us every generation. And it's how whoever is doing this is planning to murder 40,000 beings with nothing more than a plasma cutter and a thermite charge. The silence in the chamber was the heaviest kind, not the absence of conversation, but the weight of a civilization encountering a concept it had no framework for. 12 Kelthani, including a counselor and deep violet officers from a division most citizens didn't know existed, standing in the heart of their station, looking at a human maintenance worker who had defused a bomb with a refrigerator magnet and told them their entire design philosophy had a blind spot the size of a species. Deathworld spoke slowly. What would you recommend? Seal the archways. Replace every decorative transition with pressure-rated emergency doors. Harden the atmospheric boundaries between species zones, independent physical barriers, not just gradient management. Install breach detection sensors on a closed network separate from the main security grid, because the attacker has clearly compromised those specifications. Audit your personnel for anyone with both atmospheric engineering access and security system knowledge, and put someone who thinks like a predator in the room when you redesign the threat model. Someone who thinks like a predator. Someone from a world where the weather kills, the wildlife kills, and the geology kills. Someone who looks at a ventilation duct and sees not just airflow, but a weapon, a defense, and an escape route simultaneously. The counselor nodded once, slow, deliberate. The perpetrators have not been identified. No. There will be further attacks. Almost certainly. They planted that charge before we arrived. They've been in this chamber. They know every route I've mapped, and probably more that I haven't. Then what do you intend to do? Cade looked at the disabled charge, at the trunk lines carrying atmosphere to every being on the station, at the walls of a chamber built by a species that had never needed to think about sabotage, because nothing in their evolutionary history had prepared them for it. My shift starts in 20 minutes. I have 3 work orders in the queue, a regulator replacement on level 3, a scrubber recalibration in the Solari enclave, and a pressure seal inspection on the outer ring. He clipped his tools back to his belt, picked up his diagnostic scanner, checked the battery, 83%. I'm going to do my job. And while I'm doing my job, I'm going to keep checking every failure point on this station, every 4 hours, the same way I've been doing since day 2. Because that's what maintenance is. It isn't fixing things after they break. It's watching. Learning where the system is strong, where it's weak, where the pressure builds, where the seal is getting thin. And when something tries to break it, whether wildlife, geology, or someone with a plasma cutter and a grudge being there already, standing in the crawl space. Hands on the seal, doing the math before the metal gives. He nodded to the counselor, a human gesture carrying both respect and farewell, one the Kelthani had no equivalent for, and walked toward the hatch. Nobody stopped him. 12 Kelthani, officers, specialists, a counselor of the Dominion's governing body, stood in the chamber and watched a contracted maintenance worker walk away from a diffused bomb he had no authorization to touch, toward a shift he had no obligation to start, in a station he had no stake in beyond a 7-month contract and a bunk that was the wrong size. None of them understood why he was going back to work. That was the part they could not process. The breach response, the vulnerability mapping, the bomb defusal, those were extraordinary actions that could be categorized, however uncomfortably, as stress responses or survival instincts or the kind of statistical outlier that a large population occasionally produced. But the return to routine afterward, the immediate, unforced pivot from existential crisis back to work orders and pressure gauges and scrubber recalibrations. That was the thing that did not fit any model they had for sentient behavior. They did not yet understand that it was not two things. The breach response and the scrubber recalibration were the same skill, the same instinct, the same inheritance from a world where the weather was a threat and the geology was a threat, and the only beings who survived were the ones who treated maintenance as a permanent state of readiness rather than a periodic task. Behind him, in the chamber holding the station's heart, the trunk lines hummed. The air flowed. The timer on the dead charge ticked toward a zero that would never detonate. Drethvashin watched the human walk away, small, dirt-streaked, tool belt clanking against his hip, coveralls frosted at the shoulders from crawlspace condensation, and spoke to the deep violet officer beside him. She recorded it in the official log. Over the following months, it became the most cited passage in the Kelthani Dominion's revised threat assessment doctrine, referenced in 11 separate policy reviews, and quoted in full at the Galactic Transit Security Conference the following standard year. Reclassify his species, not Category 3, not any numbered category. The counselor's voice was quiet and precise and carried the weight of a civilization adjusting its understanding of the universe. File them under infrastructure. They are not an asset class. They are a load-bearing element. Remove a load-bearing element from a structure and the structure falls. That is not a metaphor. That is engineering. No one in the chamber spoke. The holographic display cycled through its status feeds, atmospheric pressure nominal, hull integrity restored, security patrols active on all levels. The numbers were green. The station was breathing. 40,000 beings were alive because a contractor from a Class 11 Deathworld had recognized the sound of a hull cutter through 3 meters of composite plating and had decided without being asked that it was his problem to solve. The hatch closed behind Cade Morrow, atmospheric systems engineer, contracted maintenance asset, external biological resource filed 3 tiers below janitorial services. He had 3 work orders in the queue. He went to work,